Alright, good morning class. So today we're going to start with transfer of property. Alright, so today we're going to start with a new chapter, that is transfer of property. So this is your last chapter for your syllabus. Alright, so before we start with the topic, let us try to understand what do we really understand by the term property. Alright, so according to the definition, property has a very wider meaning in its real sense. So, property, when we say what is a property, then it has a very large and a wide sense, isn't it? Because property can be anything, isn't it? It not only includes money and other tangible things of value, but also includes any intangible rights considered as a source or element of income or wealth. So, when we say what is property, then property is not only money, right, or wealth. Wealth equals to buildings, house, real estates, isn't it? So, property is not only defined till your money or a wealth or a tangible thing. Now, what is tangible thing? Tangible things are those things which you can feel. For example, this simple duster is a property of school. This simple duster is the property of Rockwell Academy, Kalimpong. Now this green board you see over here is a property of school, isn't it? So these things are tangible. Alright. Tangible is something which you can feel, which you can see. But property is not only tangible, but it is also intangible. Now, what are intangible properties? Now, we have already studied in our first chapter called Intellectual Property Act. Over there, we had various types of intellectual property acts, isn't it? We had copyrights, we had patent, we had trademarks. Now, these all intellectual property acts we also had copyrights, isn't it? So all of this ultimately gives what? It gives us wealth, isn't it? Supposing if I write a book which comes under copyright, now when I sell those books, then ultimately what I'm going to get? I'm going to get some wealth, isn't it? I'm going to get some money. So these are intangible, although these things can't be seen. For instance, Copyright Act can't be seen, but then also they are equally termed as properties. Alright, so this is what it's trying to tell us. The right and the interest which a man has in lands and cattle to exclusion of others. It is the right to enjoy and to dispose of certain things in the most absolute manner as he pleases, provided he makes no use them prohibited by law. Now, properties are lands, cattle, isn't it? So all we have already done in class 11 also. What are the different types of properties? They are basically two types of properties. Number one is movable property and another one is immovable property. Alright. Now, the sea, the air and the light cannot be appropriated. Everyone may enjoy them, but no one has an exclusive right in them. Now, the air which we breathe, we can't claim it as my property, isn't it? Because everyone enjoys it. Neither the sea nor the sun, isn't it? So these things can't be placed under someone's property, because these things we all enjoy and we all need in our day-to-day life. So first thing, what is a property? Property is whatever a man owns except for the provisions stated by the law, and it can be tangible or intangible. Alright. And another one is under tangible, the property can be categorized into two. One is movable and another one is immovable property. Alright. Basically, property is divided into real property and personal property. Now, property is also divided into real property and personal property. Property is also divided into absolute and qualified when it consists of goods and cattle. Absolute property is that which is our own without any qualification whatever, as when a man is the owner of watch, a book, or the intimate things, or of a horse or sheep, or the animals which never had its natural liberty in a wild state. So what are the absolute type of properties? The absolute type of properties is, for example, this duster, the watch which I am wearing, the phone which I am carrying. These are all absolute type of properties. And also those domestic animals which has been categorized, all right, not the wild animals but the domestic animals. For example, a dog, it can be a sheep, it can be a goat, it can be cattle, all right. So all these things comes under absolute type of properties, all right, which a man can directly own it, all right. Now what are the qualified properties? Qualified properties consist in the right which men have over wild animals, which they have reduced to their own position, and which are kept subject to their powers, as a deer, a buffalo, and the like, which are his own while he has possession of them. But as soon as his possession is lost, his property is gone, unless the animals go. Now, what is qualified properties? Sometimes these are especially for those who who are interested in keeping all wildlife which has been categorized, all right. So it can be a buffalo, it can be any wild animals for which he has a claim for it, all right. Supposing, for example, a man who can afford buys a plenty of land which has forest also, all right. He has a forest. Let's say, for example, the property he possesses, the 70% of his land is forest, all right. So over here, obviously the wild animals live, isn't it? So the wild animals which are living inside his land is his property, but we should remember that this will not remain for a whole lifetime. When a man dies, then he has to leave his property, all right. So this is what a qualified property is all about. It is proper to observe that in some cases, the moment that the owner loses his possession, he also loses his property or right in the things. Animals, as mentioned above, belong to the owner only while he retains the possession of them. But in general, the loss of possession does not impair the right of property, for the owner may recover it within a certain time allowed by the law. Alright? So another one is meaning and definition of property. Meaning, in general sense, property is any physical or virtual entity that is owned by an individual or jointly by a group of individuals. So property, for instance, this building, the school building, is owned by our principal. So this is his property. Now another example which I like to give is, there are some properties or there are some companies who are owned in a joint venture. For example, the Reliance group of industries that was owned by the father and the two sons, isn't it? So those property was owned by the father and the two sons. So property can be owned by one person or more than one person. Even in our day-to-day life, or in a society, or a place where we live, or a family which we have a home, isn't it? We have a house, and there can be only son or brothers, isn't it? So the ancestral home which was owned by our father or our great grandfather, that property belongs to my father. And if my father has two sons or three sons, then that property can be divided between brothers. So it can be owned by individual or a group of persons. Alright, so anything which a person owns is property. Alright. So, definition of property. There are different definitions are given in different acts as per this used and needs. But in the most important act, which exclusively talks about the property and rights related to property, Transfer of Property Act 1882 has no definite definition of the term property, but it is defined in some other act as per their use and need. Those definitions are as follows. Now, number one, which you must remember, is section 2 clause C of the Benami Transaction Act. So remember section 2 clause C of the Benami Transaction Act. Alright, what does it say or what does it define? Property means property of any kind, whether movable or immovable, tangible or intangible, and includes any right or interest in such property. So this is the definition under Benami Transaction Act section 2 clause C. So property means anything which a man owns, whether it's a movable property, movable property, or immovable property. Movable property, as we have already studied in class 11, what are the movable properties and immovable properties, isn't it? Movable properties are this duster can be moved from this place to another one, so this is a movable property. Now immovable property, this school building. So anything which is movable or immovable, tangible which can be felt, which can be seen, or intangible which can't be seen, all of this which a man owns is a property according to section 2 clause C of Benami Transaction Act of 1888. Alright, so this is the definition. Now what are the kinds of property? We have already studied movable and immovable property. Now the definition is under section 3, under section 3 clause 26, under section 3 clause 36 36 of the General Clause Act defines movable property as movable property shall mean property of every description except immovable property. So under section 336 of the General Clause Act, movable properties are everything which has been categorized except the immovable property. Alright. Now section 2(9) of Restoration Act 1908 defines property as movable property includes standing timber, growing crops and grass, fruits upon and juice in trees, and property of every other description except immovable property. So section 2 clause 9 of the Restoration Act 1908 says movable property are even grasses which we grow in our farms, even the crops, alright, even the fruits which we grow in our farms, these all are movable properties according to section 2 clause 9 of the Registration of Act. Alright, so moving on to next is immovable property. The term immovable property occurs in various central acts. However, none of those acts conclusively defines this term. The most important act which deals with the immovable property is the Transfer of Property Act, also known as TP Act. Alright. Even in the TP Act, the term is defined in exclusive terminology. That is, according to section 3 of TP Act or Transfer of Property Act, what does it say? Immovable properties does not include standing timber, growing crops or grass. Thus the term is defined in the Act by excluding certain things. Buildings constitute immovable properties, and machineries, if embedded in the buildings for the beneficial use, therefore must be deemed to be a part of the building and the land of which the building is situated. Now what is section 3 trying to tell us in TP Act is immovable properties includes all the fruits that we grow, all the crops that we grow in our farms. All right, these are all immovable properties. All right, but as soon as that crop and that fruit is transferred to some place, that becomes a movable property, isn't it? Now another one is, it has been specifically for those who are in commercial purposes. For example, there is a building, and that building is used for a paper factory. For example, let's say it's a paper factory or a factory of anything which produce or gives production. All right, so that building, according to section 3, is a immovable property, isn't it? But those machines which are being used for the production, those machines are movable, that can be moved from one place to another, isn't it? So but at the moment, what the section 3 of the act is trying to tell us, at the moment when that machine is placed inside that building and that machine starts its production. All right, for example, there is a paper factory. Now to set up a paper factory, we need a building. Now we have that is an immovable property. But the machine that has been brought inside the building, that is immovable property, isn't it? Even though it is a immovable property, that machine is a movable property, and it has been placed inside the building, and the moment it has been used to produce paper, all right, so that becomes immovable property. This is what section 3 is trying to tell us. Now, what are the essential for the transfer of property? What are the ingredients, or what are the essential things which are required for transfer of property? So number 1 is, the transfer of property must take place between 2 or more living persons. So the transaction of transfer of property must be between 2 living persons. It can't be between a living person and a dead person, isn't it? Can I transfer my property to someone who has already been dead or is a deceased? The answer is no, because I can't do so, isn't it? So it has to be between 2 living persons. The transfer of property must take place inter vivos, which means that the property must be transferred between 2 or more persons who are living. All right, the transfer and the transferee must be living entities on the date of transfer. So both the transferor and the transferee, there must be living person. If one person is dead or is a deceased, then the transfer of property can't take place. That's number 1 essential feature. Number 2 essential feature, the property transferred must be transferable. Okay, the property which is being transferred must be transferable. Now what is this mean? Section 6 lays down 13 kinds of property which cannot be transferred other than those enumerated below. All kinds of property can be transferred. So what are they? Let's try to read it out. The chance of higher operand succeeding to an asset called space succession, such as change in property as by the act, it implies to a mere hope of succession. The chains of relationship obtaining legacy on the date of kinsman cannot likewise be transferred. Now what is this trying to tell us? It's like, if I have a big property and I die without transferring my property, now my property can't be transferred. All right, my property can't be transferred. This is what it's trying to tell us. The chance of relation obtaining legacy on the date of kinsman cannot likewise be transferred. All right, any other merely possible of a likely nature that is of a nature similar to those mentioned above can't be transferred. A public officer or the salary of a public officer, whether before or after it has become payable, can't be transferred. Now another one is, like we all know that property not includes buildings or things, but it also includes monetary, isn't it? So salary of a public servant, that is government servant, also can't be transferred. So these are the few things which can't be transferred. All right, moving on to next is, the transferor must be competent to contract and entitled to transfer property or authorized to dispose of transferable property which is not his own. Now what this is trying to tell us is, under section 7 of the act, under section 7 of the TP Act, a person will be competent to transfer property if he fulfills the necessary criteria under section 11 of the Indian Contract Act 1872. Now if you remember, when we were in class 11, we have already done the Indian Contract Act. Now section 11, what does it say? It deals with the section 11 of the Indian Contract Act deals with who can get into a contract, isn't it? Who can get into a contract. Now for example, if a person is a minor, we almost see in even in movies also that when a person is minor, there is a guardian for that person, isn't it? If a person is below 18 years of old and he or she has a huge amount of property, now before he or she reaches the age of 18, that person can't transfer his property or her property in other person's name. This is what section 7 trying to tell us. Alright, let us read it out. Under section 11, a person will be competent to contract when he fulfills the criteria of being a major, that is one who has attained 18 years of age, of sound mind. Now that person also has to be of sound mind. Not only he has to be above 18 years old, but he also has to be of sound mind. Now if that person is not mentally stable and he owns a very big property, now that person can't transfer his property. Alright, so number 1 point is, according to section 7 and section 11 of the Indian Contract Act, a person has to be above 18 years of old. Number 2 point is, that person has to be mentally sound. Alright, so this is what this point is trying to tell us. Now another one is, the transfer must be made in the mode prescribed by the Act. Thus all necessary attestation and registration must be complied with. So under section 9 of the Act, it is material to sufficient register, stamp and attest the instrument to avoid further disputes. So there are certain stamps and certain duties which we have to pay, and we have to register in accordance with the instrument. This is what it is trying to tell us. Alright, so this is according to section 9 of the Act. Now another one is, the transfer must not offend the rule against perpetuity. Now what is this means is, section 14 of the Act highlights the rule of perpetuity. Perpetuity literally means eternity and infinity. Now perpetuity is, for example, this is for example, Mr. A has a big property. Now what he has decided is, he has given his, or he has transferred his property to Mr. B, and after Mr. B to Mr. C, and after Mr. C to his, if Mr. B gets married and he has a child, again to Mr. B. Now the instrument has been made in such a way that before Mr. A died, he decided to give his property to Mr. B, and after the death of Mr. B, he decided to pass his property to Mr. C, and after the death of Mr. C, again, if there is a child from Mr. B, then the property ultimately goes to the son or the daughter of Mr. B. Now what this section is trying to tell us is, now the transfer has been made to Mr. B, and after the death of Mr. B, she owns Mr. A's property. Now Mr. C can't sell this property. Alright, Mr. C can't sell Mr. A's property, or Mr. B's, who was transferred to Mr. B, can't sell his property until and unless this property moves on to Mr. B. This is what it is trying to tell us. Alright, the section 14 of the TP Act says that, again I will try to tell us, Mr. A owns a property, he transfers his property to Mr. B, and in that instrument or in his will, So Mr. B and C and B, the ultimate thing is under section 14 is like Mr. B or C can't sell the property, although he has his name. He is the owner, but then also he can't sell it. So this is what the property and the qualifications that are required to have a transfer of a property. So this was for the day, guys. So in our next class we'll continue. All right.